By the time the sun cleared the false front of Rourke Mercantile, the rope had already burned a raw red crescent into Ruth Hale's neck. She stood barefoot on the back of a buckboard in the middle of Red Bluff with her wrists tied in front of her, dust drying between her toes, and told the deputy in a voice steadier than his, "If you're bound to do a cruel thing, at least pull the knot behind my ear. My little girl shouldn't have to watch you bungle it." That was how the stranger found her. He came out of the western glare on a dark roan with a bedroll behind the saddle and the look of a man who had spent too many nights with his back to open country. His hat was low. His jaw was dark with road beard. One rifle lay across his thigh as easy as an extra arm. He slowed when he saw the scaffold wagon, the gathered town, the judge in his black coat, and the widow standing so still beneath the rope she looked less like a condemned woman than the last upright post in a storm-felled fence. Before we go any farther, settle in wherever the evening has found you, and tell us in the comments where you're listening from tonight. There is something good in knowing how many kitchens, porches, and quiet rooms are keeping each other company while this one unfolds. Ruth turned her head toward the rider. Her hair had come loose from its pins. There was blood dried at one temple. For a heartbeat she stared without recognition, as if hope were too costly a thing to spend by accident. Then her face changed. Not softened, not brightened. Changed in the deeper way a locked house changes when a long-shut door opens somewhere inside it. "Eli," she said. The name moved through the crowd like a match through dry grass. Judge Silas Rourke lifted one pale eyebrow. Sheriff Len Barlow spat into the dust. A woman near the well put her hand over her mouth. Everybody in Red Bluff knew Ruth Hale was a widow with a little girl, a stubborn strip of pasture along Cottonwood Creek, and a murder charge tied around her neck. Fewer remembered that, long before she married Daniel Hale, she had been Ruth Mercer, younger sister to a boy who had ridden away 15 years ago and left no word worth repeating. Eli Mercer swung down from the saddle without haste. Men who meant to use a gun often moved fast around it. Men who had lived by one usually didn't. He walked straight into the square, boots whispering over dust, and stopped close enough to see the bruise under Ruth's left eye. "Who says she did it?" he asked. Judge Rourke answered before anyone else could. He had one of those smooth courthouse voices that made wickedness sound almost clerical. "The law says it. Recorder Ezra Boone was found dead in her smokehouse with a knife in his chest." She was standing over him. "There are witnesses enough." Ruth did not look at the judge. She kept her eyes on her brother as if he were the only steady object in sight. "Ezra crawled there to get away from the men who stabbed him," she said. "He died trying to hand me something." Eli's gaze shifted once, slow and cold, to the judge, then to the sheriff, then back to Ruth. "What thing?" "Time," said Rourke crisply. "Time is what she's out of." He nodded to the deputy. The deputy reached for the horse's lead. Eli brought the rifle up. He did not aim it at the judge. He did not aim it at the sheriff. He put the front sight on the knot above the wagon tongue and said, "Any man takes one more step, he'd best do it after speaking to God." There are moments when a town shows you exactly what it is. Red Bluff showed itself then. Not one man rushed him. Not one. They stood in a ring of dust and heat and morning light and waited to see who would tell them what kind of courage they possessed. Judge Rourke's mouth thinned. "You ride into a lawful hanging with a rifle and expect me to be impressed?" "No," Eli said. "I expect you to be careful." From the edge of the crowd, Ruth's daughter June broke free of the schoolteacher's grip and ran 2 blind steps toward the wagon before Miss Agnes Pike caught her again. The child's sob came thin and sharp on the air. Eli heard it. Ruth heard it. And something in the square changed shape around that sound. Rourke heard it too, and because he was a vain man as well as a cruel one, he understood the danger of being seen plainly. He folded his gloves together. "Very well," he said. "I am not so hard a servant of justice that I would deny a condemned woman an hour with her kin. Take her down. Noon. If no miracle presents itself by then, the sentence stands." The crowd loosened the way a rope loosens when weight comes off it. Angry, disappointed, relieved. Men coughed. Hats shifted. Somebody muttered that it changed nothing. Ruth was lowered from the wagon. Her knees buckled once when the rope came free, and Eli caught her by the elbows before she hit the ground. She was lighter than he remembered and harder too. Miss Agnes brought June in a rush of skirts and tears. Ruth dropped to both knees, wrists still bound, and pressed her face into the child's hair. "Look at me, Junebug." Look at Mama. I am not gone. Do you hear me? Not gone. June nodded against her, trembling. Eli reached for the binding rope. Sheriff Barlow stepped forward. Hands where I can see them. Eli's eyes stayed on the knot. If I'd meant to start shooting, Sheriff, we'd be having a different kind of morning. Maybe I'd welcome it. No, Ruth said quietly, rising. You wouldn't. Blood tells the truth too fast. That gave the sheriff pause, and it gave Eli his first true look at his sister. 15 years had put silver nowhere in her hair yet, but they had put wear into the corners of her mouth and a stillness into her shoulders that had not belonged to the laughing, quick-tempered girl he had left behind. Daniel Hale, he saw at once, had not been the thing that made her strong. Loss had done that. Loss and raising a child where mercy ran thin. They were given Ruth's kitchen for the hour, under guard at the back door. Miss Agnes took June to the washroom and hummed with a voice that shook. Eli stood in the center of that little room, smelling coffee gone cold, flour dust, lamp oil, and the faint clean scent of soap still clinging to a house the law had just tried to turn into a grave. Ruth held the edge of the table until the tremor left her hands. Then she crossed to the stove, reached beneath a loose floorboard with bound wrists, and brought up a brass survey compass blackened with old handling. Daniel's, she said. He left it where he knew I'd find it if things turned bad. Eli stared at the compass. I got one letter from him. In Cheyenne, 3 weeks late. Said if I had any Christian blood left in me, I should come. Didn't say why. Because he knew mail can be read. Ruth set the compass on the table between them. Daniel wasn't killed in the creek like they said. He was beaten to death up at North Stone because he found what Silas Rourke had been doing with widow claims and boundary lines. Ezra Boone tried to help me prove it. That's why Ezra died. That's why I was on that wagon. Eli said nothing. Ruth looked at him the way only a sister can look at a brother she has loved longer than she has trusted him. You can take June and ride if you mean to. I'd not blame you for it. But if I hang, Rourke gets this land, Daniel's grave, my girl's guardianship, and every poor widow he's cheated these past 8 years. He's already moved lines on half the creek. Men signed papers they couldn't read. Women signed papers they were made to fear. Daniel copied everything before they killed him. Where? I don't know yet. Her throat worked once against the raw mark the rope had left. But Ezra's last words were North Stone. Outside, boots scraped the porch. Noon waited like an axe over the door. Eli picked up the compass. The brass was warm from her hand. For a long moment, he said nothing at all. Then he slid the cylinder open, checked the needle, and for the first time since riding into town, he looked like a man who had stopped passing through and started arriving. All right, he said. We do it your way first. That was the point of no return. Not when he raised the rifle in the square. Not when she said his name. It was there, in a widow's kitchen smelling of cold coffee and fear, when the brother who had spent 15 years outriding his own guilt chose not to flee with what he could save, but to stay for what had been stolen. Miss Agnes hid June in the root cellar beneath the schoolhouse with blankets, a jar of peach preserves, and a reader whose cover had gone soft at the corners from many children's hands. Eli hated leaving the girl there. Ruth hated it more. But they had an hour before noon, a town owned by one man's money, and only the land left to tell the truth. They saddled behind the barn to keep from the sheriff's eyes. Ruth moved like someone who had long since learned not to waste motion. She stepped into Daniel's old boots, cinched her skirt up for riding with a leather thong, and laid the survey chain across the pommel as if it belonged there. Eli watched her test the compass against the sun, then count off a distance from the fence post to the cottonwood by the creek with her lips barely moving. You still do that, he said. Do what? Count when you're angry. I count when I mean to be exact. A ghost of something passed between them then. Not yet warmth, but memory. He remembered her as a girl measuring seed rows with a willow wand because their father said a careless hand was just another kind of lie. They rode north through creek grass, silvered by the morning wind. Cottonwoods whispered overhead. Meadowlarks lifted and dropped. At a bend in the stream, Ruth reined in and dismounted to study a cut bank where the clay had slumped after spring runoff. She brushed dirt from a stake head, then another. See that, she said. This line was shifted. Fresh, within the year. Daniel said Rourke's men kept moving witness markers farther west, swallowing pasture a strip at a time. Eli crouched beside her. You can tell that from this. I can tell because the old surveyors blazed the cottonwoods before statehood, and trees don't lie for men. She touched a scar on the bark with 2 fingers, almost tenderly. A town can teach itself not to look. The land can't. It keeps every lie exactly where you buried it. That was the first line he would remember later, long after the shooting, because it sounded like Ruth and Daniel and their father and every honest thing the years had not beaten out of this world. They found Daniel's first sign of danger half a mile farther on. A patch of turned earth beside a limestone rise. Not grave-shaped. Too narrow. Eli dug with his hands and came up with an oilcloth bundle containing 3 pages of field notes, a stub of carpenter's pencil, and a note in Daniel Hale's tidy script. If Ruth has this, I have run out of time. North Stone is not north of town. It is the old survey name for the basalt marker on Miller Ridge. Rourke changed the maps in the courthouse book, not the land. Trust the original line. Trust Ruth more than any man who says he knows it better. Eli read it once, then again. Ruth took the pages from him. Her fingers shook only when they touched Daniel's handwriting. He knew, she said. He knew they'd come. He knew you'd keep going. No, she looked up, eyes bright and hard. He knew they'd think I couldn't. That was the thing about women like Ruth. Towns mistook endurance for softness until the day endurance turned and bit them. The road to Miller Ridge was longer than it looked from the valley. It climbed through broken sage and loose shale where horses had to pick their way. Halfway up they heard riders behind them. 3 at first, then more. The sound carried thin on the wind, metal tapping leather, tack creaking, men urging mounts harder than the ground liked. Eli slid from the saddle and listened with his cheek against the rock. Rourke's men, Ruth asked. Too many for chance. She looked down the slope, then toward the ridge above them. If we turn back, they run us into town empty-handed. If we keep on, they have to come single file through the cut. He glanced at her. That a suggestion? That's land. He smiled then, quick and unwilling. Daniel chose well. For one heartbeat, she almost smiled back. Then the hoofbeats came closer. They led the horses into a narrow wash where juniper roots clutched the dirt like hands. Eli took position behind a rock shelf. Ruth lay flat farther up with Daniel's old Sharps rifle braced across a saddle roll. When the first rider came through the cut, Eli fired low and took the man's horse in the shoulder. Animal and rider went down in a knot of dust and sound. The second man jerked back. The third tried to wheel around, and Ruth shot the brim clean off his hat. Next one's your ear, she called. They had expected a timid widow and an outlaw too eager for a quick draw. What they found was a brother who knew where to wait, and a sister who knew where a bullet would scare better than kill. The men fell back. Eli used the pause to push upward through the cut, boots sliding, lungs burning. Ruth came behind with the chain over one shoulder and the rifle in her hand. Near the top, where the ridge flattened into wind-gnawed stone, they found the marker Daniel had met, a basalt post shoulder-high, buried deep, one side carved with a surveyor's cross almost worn smooth by weather. Ruth knelt at once. She set the compass, measured from the post to a scatter of bleached rock, counted 23 paces east, stopped, turned south 3, dropped to one knee and drove the heel of her palm into the dirt. H here, she whispered. Daniel marked it. They dug with a skillet-sized rock and their bare hands until Eli's fingers struck metal. He hauled up a rusted survey tube capped in brass. Inside were 2 rolled plats, a packet of property liens, and a signed affidavit from Ezra Boone naming Judge Silas Rourke, Sheriff Lynn Barlow, and 2 ranch hands present at Daniel Hale's killing. Beneath that lay a list of 21 widows and smallholders whose lines had been altered to benefit Rourke cattle and mercantile. Eli exhaled once, rough and stunned. This is enough to bury him. Ruth was staring at the bottom sheet. What? She handed it over. It was the copy of Daniel's final letter, the one he had sent in 3 versions to 3 names Eli had used on the trail. I do not know which name he answers to now, Ruth, but I know he is still your brother. If I fail you, let him come fail you less than he has before. The words struck harder than any bullet. Eli looked away first. Below them, the riders were climbing again. If you'd been in Eli's place, the old storyteller in every one of us might ask here, would you have taken your sister, the child, and the proof and vanished into open country? Or would you have ridden back into a town where the judge owned the law, the sheriff owned the jail, and half the men owed both of them money? That question matters, because this is where a life turns from survival into character. Eli rolled the papers tight, tucked them inside his shirt, and handed Ruth the affidavit to put in her bodice. "If they kill me, you keep riding east. If they kill me, you keep riding east," she said. "That child needs one of us more than this town does. That child needs her mother with her name left clean." He held her gaze. She did not flinch. At last he gave one short nod. They mounted and cut down the north face of the ridge through scrub too mean for cattle. The descent was worse than the climb. Loose stones slid under the horses. Twice June's old red ribbon, tied to Ruth's saddle ring for luck, whipped against Eli's hand like a warning. At the bottom, they found the second sign that the storm had already outrun them. Miss Agnes Pike's mare was wandering riderless in the willows, reins dragging. Ruth went cold all at once. June. They found the schoolteacher 20 yards farther on, propped against a cottonwood with blood at the corner of her mouth, where someone had struck her. She was conscious enough to clutch Ruth's sleeve. "June's safe," she whispered. "I moved her when I heard riders. Old Hob at the undertaker's. He put her in the coffin room because no man in this town is eager to search there." Her breath caught. "Rourke knows you've gone for the land papers. He's called the town to the square. Says if you're not there by sundown, he'll put the child in county care tonight and hang you at dawn whether you stand there or not." The world narrowed. Eli could hear only the creak, Miss Agnes's breath, and the small animal sound Ruth made without meaning to. Not fear. Worse. A mother calculating how much time remained before strangers laid hands on her child and called it legal. They half-carried Miss Agnes to Hobbs' wagon shed and left her with the blacksmith, Inez Crow, a broad-shouldered woman who smelled of coal smoke and lavender water and had the useful habit of spitting before she lied. "I saw nothing," she told them, wiping her hands on a leather apron. "And if I had, I'd remember it different by the time the sheriff asked." "Can you get June to the ridge cabin?" Ruth asked. Inez nodded. "By dark. Take no road. I was born female in a place run by men," Inez said. "You think I don't know how to travel unseen?" Then the posse came sooner than any of them expected. One shot broke the window first. The second hit the door hinge. Eli shoved Ruth to the floor as splinters rained across the room. Sheriff Barlow's voice came from outside, loud with official certainty. "Mercer, Hale, you are surrounded." "No, we ain't," Inez muttered, shoving a box of nails under the back table. "They never surround proper. Too much work." The third shot caught Eli high in the left shoulder when he leaned to return fire. He went backward hard enough to rattle the iron stove. Ruth was beside him before the rifle hit the floor. She clamped a hand over the wound, and the heat of his blood flooded between her fingers. His face had gone gray, but his right hand still searched blindly for the revolver. "Leave it," she said. He bared his teeth. "That's not my habit. Make a new one." The room filled with gun smoke, hammer clang, boot noise, horses screaming outside. Inez fired through the forge gap with a shotgun that kicked like a mule. Somebody on the porch yelled and dropped. Ruth hooked Eli's good arm over her shoulders and got him to his feet. He was heavier than sorrow and just as stubborn. "There's a coal chute," Inez barked. "Leads behind the tannery." Ruth dragged her brother through heat, smoke, and black dust. Behind them the forge door burst inward. In front of them the chute dropped like a throat into darkness. She did not hesitate. She shoved Eli through first, then slid after him on elbows and knees, scraping skin off both palms as gunfire boomed over their heads. They came out behind the tannery in a stink of hides and lye while evening gathered purple over town. Eli tried to stand. Blood had soaked his shirt to the belt. "We need the ridge cabin," Ruth said. "We need the square. We need you not dead." He swayed once, then nodded. They made the ridge cabin after dark with the moon coming up pale over the flats. June was already there under quilts, asleep from crying, one small fist closed around the brass button from Daniel's work coat. Inez had reached it before them. So had Mercy, for once. The cabin was scarcely more than a lined shack with one room, one cot, and a stove that smoked if you fed it pine. But it held 4 walls, a latch, water in a bucket, and enough silence for truth to enter. Ruth cut Eli's shirt from the wound while he sat braced against the table, jaw locked so tight a vein stood in his temple. The bullet had gone through clean, thanks to distance and bad aim, but the flesh around it was angry and torn. She boiled Daniel's forceps, poured whiskey over linen, worked by lamplight while June slept and the wind thudded softly against the boards. When she probed the wound, he hissed through his teeth, "You always this gentle? Only with the deserving. Then I may be in trouble." She almost laughed. It surprised both of them. After she bandaged him, she sat on the floor with her back against the cot, too tired to pretend she was not tired. Eli watched her in the lamp glow. The rope mark on her throat had darkened. Soot smudged one cheek. There was dried blood at the hem of her skirt that was not hers and cold dust in the lines of her hands. "I got your letters," he said at last. She did not look up. "I know." "I didn't answer." "I know that too. I read every one." That made her turn. Not sharply. Slowly, like an old hurt being touched in the dark. He stared at the stove door, at the little orange seam around it. "First one came when I was in Ogallala. Ma had been dead 6 months by then. You said you'd married Daniel. Wrote that he was kind. Asked if I'd come see the place by Cottonwood because the fishing was good and June might like an uncle. I read it in a saloon yard with a bounty poster in my pocket and blood on my cuff from a man I'd brought in meaner than I needed to. I told myself I'd write when I was cleaner." Ruth said nothing. Then another came. Then another. "After a while, I figured a man can go so long without hearing his own name that he starts to believe the dirt has already claimed it. I thought if I stayed away long enough, I'd do you less harm." That was the line that would have lived in 1,000 comments if there had been comments in that little cabin. It landed quiet, which is the only way the truest lines ever do. Ruth drew one knee up and wrapped both arms around it. "Do you know what I wanted from you? A brother." "No," she shook her head. "Not even that, by the end. I wanted one witness. Just one. Someone who remembered me from before all this, and would say out loud that I had not always been the woman folks found it convenient to accuse." He looked at her then. Really looked. "You were never that woman." Her mouth trembled once. She pressed it flat. "Daniel did see me. I will give life that much. He saw me from the first day. But after he died, I got so tired, Eli. Tired of bartering. Tired of signatures. Tired of men using soft voices right before they took another bite. I stopped asking for rescue. I just kept the child fed and the fences up." He leaned forward despite the pain and put Daniel's brass compass into her hands. "Then don't ask for rescue now. Ask for help." For a long moment neither spoke. The stove ticked. June murmured in her sleep. Outside, a coyote called once and was answered from far down the draw. Ruth opened her palm. In it lay the compass, and, beneath it, a small carved horse of cottonwood root polished smooth by years of handling. "Papa made this for you," she said. "I kept it because I was angry. That seems fair. I brought it tonight because I didn't know if you'd live long enough for me to stay angry in person." That time he did laugh, low and pained and real. She gave him the little horse. He turned it over in his big hand like a relic from a country he thought had burned down. When he looked up again, there was something in his face that had not been there at dawn. Not peace, but room for it, maybe. If this story is moving you, you are exactly who it was written for. A like and a subscribe is how you tell us to keep bringing you these people who refuse to break where the world expects them to. Ruth rose after a while and crossed to the window. Below them, Red Bluff lay in pockets of lantern light. The courthouse roof shone dull as bone. Somewhere in that dark square, Silas Rourke was still certain the morning belonged to him. "He'll make a spectacle of it at dawn," she said. "Good," Eli answered. She turned. "He thinks crowds make him strong. Let's prove him wrong where everybody can see." They rode into Red Bluff at first light, with the sky still pearl gray behind the livery roofs. Inez took June through the undertaker's alley to the church, where Miss Agnes waited with half the town's children under pretense of hymn practice. Old Hob himself, who embalmed in silence and chewed cloves to cover the smell, rolled open his wagon door and grunted at Eli. "Judge sent for a coffin last night. Ordered walnut. I built pine. That your rebellion? At my age, son, economy is rebellion." The square was already filling when Ruth and Eli stepped into it side by side. Judge Rourke stood on the courthouse steps in black broadcloth, clean-shaven, rested, and furious at being made to wait another morning for his public lesson. Sheriff Barlow flanked him with 2 deputies. Men from Rourke's outfit formed a hard half-circle near the hitch rail. But the rest of the crowd was different from the day before. Less eager, more awake. Miss Agnes's bruised mouth had been seen. Inez's broken window had been seen. And news, unlike law, does not always stay bought. Rourke spread his hands. "Mrs. Hale, you save us trouble by presenting yourself. I didn't come for your convenience, Ruth said. A murmur moved through the crowd. The judge's smile thinned. Eli stepped forward, hat off now, wound hidden under a clean shirt the color of dust. Before you touch her, you'll hear this. Rourke laughed softly. From whom? A hired gun? A drifter without standing. From Ruth Hale, owner of Cottonwood Creek as bounded under original survey. From Ezra Boone, county recorder, murdered for trying to say so. And from Daniel Hale, whom you had beaten to death and thrown in water because he found your theft too ugly to ignore. That hit the square like a hammer. Barlow reached for his sidearm. Ruth's voice cut over him. Don't. It was not loud. It did not need to be. She stepped to the hitch rail, laid the brass survey compass on it where everyone could see, and unrolled the original plat with both hands. Wynne tried to take it. She held fast. My husband surveyed the north line of Cottonwood and the widow parcels west of town under county order. This is his copy. These are Ezra Boone's signatures. The courthouse book was altered after both men died. She turned and pointed, not to the judge, but beyond him, past the square, toward the creek. That cottonwood by the bend still bears the first blaze. The basalt north stone still stands on Miller Ridge. The distances between them have not changed, no matter what Judge Rourke wrote in his book. You expect farmers to read plats? Rourke said smoothly. You expect women and hired hands to judge county record? No, Ruth said. I expect them to count. From under her shawl, she drew the list of names. And then she did the boldest thing in the whole story. Bolder than facing the rope. Bolder than crossing gunfire. She began to read the names aloud. Mrs. Ellen Porter. 12 acres west line stolen by mortgage revision after her husband froze in the big winter. Samuel Keene. Water share cut 1/3 after his blindness petition. Mrs. Ada Norris. Grazing strip moved 6 chains south after probate hearing held without notice. Thomas Weller. Store debt doubled against forged mark. By the 5th name the crowd had stopped breathing together. By the 10th, people were pushing forward. By the 15th, a woman near the pump was crying openly and a man by the barber pole had taken off his hat because he suddenly remembered he owned one. Rourke's face changed. The smoothness broke. That is enough, he snapped. No, Ruth said, and kept reading. Barlow lunged for the papers. Eli moved between them, hand low, not yet drawing. Easy. You threatening an officer? I'm warning a thief. Rourke made the mistake men like him always make when truth starts slipping its rope. He reached for force because persuasion had finally failed him. He snatched the marshal's shotgun from the steps and swung the barrel not at Eli, but toward the church lane where June had just appeared in Miss Agnes's arms, small and white-faced in her blue dress. Drop the papers, he said to Ruth, or I start collecting what's owed another way. Everything in the square went still. Here was the final test. Eli's old self could solve it in one flash of powder. Kill the judge. Watch him fall. Let the rest sort itself out. That was the easy road. The road he had taken in 20 other towns with 20 other bad men whose names he could not remember. But this was Ruth's town. June's future. Daniel's grave. Killing Silas Rourke in front of half the county would leave the truth buried under one more corpse and call it justice because it was quicker. So Eli did the harder thing. He took his hand away from his revolver. Gasps rippled outward. Rourke smiled with one corner of his mouth, thinking he had won. Then Ruth moved. She did not reach for Eli's gun. She did not beg. She seized the survey chain from the hitch rail, flung its weighted end low, and snapped it around Rourke's shotgun barrel just behind the front sight. With both hands, she jerked hard and down. The barrel swung wide. The blast tore a hole through the courthouse sign. In the same motion, Eli stepped in, caught Rourke's wrist, and twisted until the gun hit the boards. Barlow drew at last. Inez Crow cracked him across the forearm with a blacksmith's hammer handle from behind the water trough. Miss Agnes dragged June flat behind the church wagon. Old Hob, of all people, planted a boot on the fallen shotgun and said in his funeral parlor murmur, "Now there's no cause to rush. Plenty of time for boxes later." Rourke clawed for Eli's wound with his free hand. Eli hissed, staggered, and still did not draw. Instead, he shoved the judge backward into the courthouse pillar hard enough to rattle the glass. "My name," he said, voice carrying clear across the square, "is Eli Mercer. I was born in this territory, and I have spent 15 years forgetting how to stand in one place long enough to be of use. I won't make that mistake again. This woman is Ruth Hale, and any man wanting to touch her will do it after admitting, in front of every soul here, that he is helping Silas Rourke steal from widows and fatherless children. No one moved. That was the moment Red Bluff chose. Not when the proof appeared. Proof helps, but people can step over proof if fear pays well enough. No, the town chose when the judge looked around for his usual obedience and found instead Miss Agnes with blood on her lip, Inez Crow with fire in her eyes, Old Hob on the shotgun, half a dozen cheated ranchers stepping out of the crowd, and one widow after another moving toward Ruth, as if they had been waiting years for somebody to read their names aloud in daylight. Ellen Porter came first, tiny and bent and fierce as dry wire. "He took my Westfield," she said. Samuel Keene raised his blind eyes toward the sound of Rourke's breathing. "Mine too." Then Ada Norris. Then Tom Weller. Then others. Quiet people. The dangerous kind once they stopped being quiet. Sheriff Barlow tried to gather authority around himself and found it leaking. "Back away. All of you." "From what?" Inez asked. "The law or your employer?" Rourke saw it going and ran. Not far. Men like that never truly believe they can lose, so they are always slower than they ought to be when loss finally comes. He shoved off the pillar, bolted toward the alley, and got 3 strides before Ruth bent, scooped the dropped affidavit from the boards, and called after him in a voice sharpened by everything he had taken from her. "Silas Rourke." He looked back. Vanity again. That cost him. Eli's fist caught him across the mouth, and this time when Rourke fell, half the town saw not a judge but a man with blood on his teeth and fear where pride used to sit. Barlow ran for the livery, maybe for a horse, maybe for distance. June stepped from behind Miss Agnes and pointed with a child's terrible clarity. "Mama," she said, "that's the man from our barn the night Papa didn't come home." Children notice the truth before adults find language for it. Ruth crossed the square, stood over Silas Rourke where he sprawled in dust and broken dignity, and laid Daniel's compass on his chest. "You moved lines on paper," she said. "You forgot the land had witnesses." By noon, Rourke and Barlow were in the very jail they had meant for her. The deputies, seeing how the wind had changed, remembered they were salaried by the county and not by the devil personally. The courthouse book was searched. Altered pages were found. Rourke Mercantile's back office gave up duplicate ledgers beneath a false shelf. Every name Ruth had read was matched by theft. Every lie had a figure beside it. Justice, when it finally arrived, was not quick. Real justice rarely is. But it was complete. Silas Rourke was removed as probate judge before the month was out and tried in Cheyenne on fraud, conspiracy, and murder after 2 of his ranch hands decided loyalty was an expensive habit. Len Barlow testified to save his own skin and lost it anyway. Rourke's holdings were broken apart in fines, restitution, and forced sale. Widow parcels were restored. Mortgages forged under his seal were voided. Men who had bowed to him for years pretended they had always doubted him, which is another way cowardice tries to keep clean. Red Bluff did not become heaven after that. Towns do not change their souls in a day, but they changed enough. Miss Agnes went back to teaching with a new straightness in her spine. Inez Crow got more work than ever because men who had once spoken over her now had to hand her horseshoes with respect or do without. Old Hob started building walnut coffins only for the deserving. And when folks passed Ruth Hale in the street, they no longer saw a woman it might be useful to corner. They saw the one who had stood under a rope and still found breath enough to speak names into daylight. Eli stayed. That surprised everyone except June, who accepted it at once and began leaving him chores and folded scraps of paper as if uncles routinely appeared out of gun smoke and grief to mend gates. He put up a new fence along the true west line. Ruth took him to Miller Ridge and showed him where Daniel first kissed her because, she said, dead men ought not be erased by the living merely because pain makes it tempting. On Sundays the 3 of them sat on the porch after supper while June read haltingly from Miss Agnes's books and Eli whittled animals out of cottonwood root with the concentration of a man learning that gentleness can also be a discipline. By first frost, the creek pasture was theirs beyond dispute. Not because a judge said so, though judges finally had. Because the posts stood where they belonged. Because the cattle watered there in peace. Because no one came by night anymore to shift what could not be honestly bought. Months later, when winter laid a white edge on the fences and the kitchen windows glowed gold against the cold, Ruth stood at the stove making biscuits while June set out jam and Eli came in carrying an armload of split cedar that filled the room with clean, sharp scent. He stamped snow from his boots, set the wood by the hearth, and June ran straight into his legs so hard he had to brace himself on the table to stay upright. He looked down at her, then across at Ruth, and something easy passed between them at last. Peace, Ruth learned, was not the absence of what had hurt you. It was the porch light left burning anyway. From the rise above Cottonwood Creek, their house shone warm against the snow-dark fields, one square of lamplight resting easy in the wide Wyoming night. Next time, stay with us for the story of a deaf seamstress sent west in disgrace to marry a one-armed rancher she has never met, only to discover he is the first man who has ever listened to her exactly as she is.